Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have on there is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on an orienteering expedition, basically a long trek throughout woodlands and rural villages following nothing but a map and compass. No GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience, and you camp and overcome hurdles together, etc. I was out of shape at the time, so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight, which is what I would need to do during the real thing, but we hiked 10 miles through woods in a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey, we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back in the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey, we were on a dirt trail heading uphill with bushes and trees on either side. We were marching onwards in silence at this point, until all of a sudden, there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He looked to be in his late 70s or perhaps early 80s. Very pale, with liver spots dotting his face and a grey and white comb-over to match. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that to go into the woods? The instant thought is that seeing some guy at this age out in the woods in these clothes and in these weather conditions is that this guy has certainly lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice though that puzzled me. He was bone dry, didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked as seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, then became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He began flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, and that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk, then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After a minute he disappeared ahead of us, but we could hear him and continued following the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down at the slope. It was probably a 40-degree angle and spanned for at least 50 feet or more and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given there were no shrubs or roots to hold onto or anything. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering how the heck did he cross it so quickly and cleanly. I mean, at that distance it's hard to see any fine detail clearly at all, but I swear he didn't appear wet or muddy at all. Me and my uncle looked at each other, and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step towards the edge, and was going to try and make my way down, when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. "Something's wrong here," he said under his breath. We took a few steps back from the edge, and at this point the old man at the bottom started to get irate. He began pleading with us to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help. His friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down at the old man that we would head back to our car and call emergency services. That professional help would be on its way soon, and they would have all the tools that they needed to help. The old man then got furious and began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right away, or there would be hell to pay. His voice changed drastically at this point. He was now practically growling his words, his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out their sockets, his skin gone pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came in, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter-mile or so to the car. All the while my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services, explaining to them that there was a possibly mentally ill man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get into our car and await the police so that we could show them where we had encountered him. About an hour later we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them, and a pack of supplies like first aid and emergency blankets. We led them to the exact spot and then pointed the 2 officers with dogs in the direction he led us through the bushes, and the search lasted a weekend, but there was never any trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. This has been one of my weirdest experiences to date. I went exploring with a bunch of friends at the Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Portions of this place are underground. The buildings were left with hospital equipment, beds, books, patient files, literally everything. It's eerie as if a zombie apocalypse occurred and everyone left. It operated from 1864 to 1994. The facility was self-sustaining, i.e. the patients farmed the land and had all resources on campus. The years this was open, a lot of horror stories came out this place. This wasn't the modern-day psychiatric ward, more like a prison where families paid a lot of money to hide their mentally ill, or the state put undesirables. Now, there's an underground network, but was heavily blocked off with chains. However, the main buildings were easily accessible, but the access ways to the underground were blocked off inside as well. Every time we got near one of the underground tunnel systems, we could hear faint music playing. It sounded like a music box. We found a bent wired gate and attempted to file in. The music got louder, and we were all pretty freaked out. We were all promptly arrested before going into the tunnels. There's a lot of speculation about the tunnel still to this day. The new owner said he was afraid of asbestos and was fearing for our safety. He was very grim and agreed to drop charges if we never went back. We obliged happily. Still, I sometimes think of my interactions there, all of the remnants left behind, and get severely creeped out. Let's set the background first. I grew up in a very rural area. My parents have a pretty big piece of land with a nice 2-story farmhouse in the middle of it. To the south of the house is a peach orchard. The west is where the driveway is. It goes through an alley of cottonwood and pecan trees, but the land is pretty open and was used for cattle farming. The east and north is dense woodland and shrubs, which reaches all the way to our neighbors about 2 miles. Back then, I was working at a carpenter shop in town. I had just gotten my driver's license, and so I was able to get there on my own. It was about an hour-and-a-half drive, though. We started fairly late in the day at about 10 a.m. The owner of the company was sort of a night owl and loved to sleep in, but because of that, we had to stay until 9 p.m. That was no problem in the summer, but turned out to be a bit of a nuisance in the winter, as it got dark pretty early, and I hated driving in the dark because the lights on my car weren't the best anymore. I drove a 1987 Chevy pickup, which had obviously seen better days. I hadn't had much money back then, so this was all I could afford. So one day in late December, about 10 or 11 years ago, I left work much later than usual. I'd made a pretty stupid mistake on a nightstand I was building for a customer and needed to fix it. As the customer was going to pick it up the next day, when I finally finished, it was about midnight. I cussed out my own stupidity, closed the shop up tight, and went to my car. There are 2 routes I can take to get home. One is on a highway, the other one is through the backcountry, and dirt roads surrounded by thick brush and trees. I usually took the highway, as it was much faster and safer, especially in the dark. But this day, there had been an accident, and the highway was blocked by emergency services, so I took the long way home. As soon as I left the main road and made my way up the dirt trails, I got this feeling, you know the one, as if something bad is about to happen, almost like impending doom. The longer I drove on the road, the stronger the feeling got, until it felt like all of my body and soul were aching desperately to turn around, drive back all the way to the roadblock, and wait until it got opened again. I tried to suppress it as best I could, and tried to convince myself that I had driven this route many times, and I knew that it was safe, albeit a bit rough on the truck. When I was driving through an especially rugged piece of brush only about 10 miles from my parents' farm, all of a sudden, my left front tire popped. I did my best to keep the truck on the road and made it to a safe spot. I kept a spare tire in the toolbox and had changed tires quite a lot on my own, and I knew it would be just a minor inconvenience and I would be rolling again in a matter of minutes. That's where I was wrong. I climbed up on the truck's bed, only to find that my toolbox had been broken into, and all of my tools and my spare tire had been stolen. So there I was, still miles away from the nearest settlement, in bear and wolf country, in the middle of the night with no cell phone, and no way to repair my truck. I always kept a sort of survival kit in my toolbox with a blanket, a small axe, a fire starter kit, and some MREs, but it had been stolen too. Thank God I still had my trusty pucko, which my sister gave me when she moved to Finland. So I made the second, but bigger mistake on the day. I decided to walk home. To this day, I still don't know why I made this decision. All I had to do was wait in my truck until sunrise, and I knew a neighbor was driving this road every day at around 8 a.m. He could have taken me to town and called my parents to get the truck, but some stupid fart in my brain said, "Nah, we're walking." So I went. I locked the car, took my rucksack with my belongings with me, and began walking. I couldn't have walked far when I got this eerie feeling, like something or somebody is watching me. I turned around, but nothing was there. I picked up my pace to make it out, when all of a sudden I heard some rustling in the bushes to my left. I called out, "If there's someone there," but of course received no answer. The feeling of being watched got stronger and stronger as the rustling became more frequent, when suddenly the brush stopped and I came to a small clearing. That's when he spoke to me for the first time. "Hey there, boy." He had a pretty weird pronunciation. The first part was spoken softly, almost gently, but the boy was like an explosion in my ears. He made a tiny pause in between and then spewed out boy. He was big, 6'6", wearing a long trench coat and hat. Grey, short hair with lifeless eyes, almost like that of a perished fish. But what really scared me was his dog. He had a huge, black, shepherd-like dog, but it looked very wild, almost like a wolf. I immediately froze with fear. I always heard this term, but could never imagine it being like this. I couldn't move. I just couldn't. I tried, trust me, God, did I try. "What you doing there, boy?" he asked. "Don't you want to talk to me, boy?" I still couldn't move a finger, but my mouth slowly started to work again. I told him about the truck and how I was trying to walk home, but I don't think he was able to understand a word that I was saying, as I was stuttering and slurring the words due to fear. He made few steps towards me, his dog fixated on me like prey. He came so close that I could smell him, a very odd smell, a bit like old cigarettes, but there was something else that I couldn't point out. I still stood there unable to move. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, almost like he wanted to remember the smell of fear radiating from me. He started to grin, not a genuine, honest grin, but the one where the eyes aren't involved. They stayed as lifeless as they were. "Be careful out here, boy. There's a lot of dangerous things out here, boy," he said, and vanished into the brush as suddenly as he had appeared. I started to thaw up and was able to move my body again. All of a sudden, my knees felt weak and wouldn't bear the weight of my body anymore. I collapsed to the ground and my whole body began to shake uncontrollably, and I began to sob with relief. As soon as I had regained control over my body again, I ran like I never did before and never have again, all the way home, which was quite a long way. I can't describe the feeling of relief coming over me when I saw the all-so-familiar porch lights coming up in the distance, and I reached the edge of the woodlands on our property. "Hey there, boy." My heart skipped a beat. I screamed from sheer terror and knew that this would be the end. So, I didn't stop running. I ran and ran and ran and never even bothered to look back. Only when I reached the warm yellow circles of light cast by our porch lamps did I dare look back. He stood there on the edge of the woods, like he did on the clearing, his animal on a leash next to him. He grinned this creepy grin again. I fumbled out my keys, as my parents locked the back door at 8. I unlocked the door and stumbled in. Only when I had locked the door I started to feel remotely safe again. I went upstairs to my room and made sure that all the windows were locked on my way out. When I looked out the window, he was gone. I told my dad about this when we got into the truck the next day. He said this was likely Samuel, an old hermit who had a small cottage down there in the woods, who had been living there for at least 30 years, but that he had never seen him with his own eyes. So in retrospect, perhaps I was never in grave danger. Maybe. But nevertheless, to the strange creep in the woods, I'd rather not meet you again. My friends and I discovered the opening to a tunnel to the sewer system this one summer in middle school, and me and my friends started to go there to smoke and relax away from the public. There was this one spot that we liked that was dry and full of graffiti, so that was our spot, but it was pretty deep in there. One day we noticed the messages on the wall, and we knew it was fresh since we'd never seen it before. We went back again and again without any further incident. One day, me and the other two decided to skip school and going there to chill. We were there for about half an hour, and we had just finished smoking a blunt when we started hearing a faint voice burst into laughter, followed by other voices bursting into laughter. We couldn't tell if it was coming from the entrance or the deeper part of the tunnel. We stayed quiet, started hearing the laughter getting louder and more intense. One of my friends quickly went up to the nearest manhole cover and started pushing up. My other friend went over to help, and they were able to open it. We crawled out of there onto a busy road and ran for our lives to the nearest apartment complex. We never went back after that. The details I have on this story are very vague, but someone told me about a teenager who went into the Akala National Forest to hike and then was reported missing several days later when he didn't return home. A couple of months later he was found in the woods, and he was like a different person. He appeared to be either drunk or under the influence, but when he was tested, everything came back negative. Mentally he wasn't all there, but physically wasn't showing any signs of being exposed to anything which would cause this. He kept telling people that he encountered something very strange. It was several months before he was himself again, and he had very little memory of what had happened all those days. I've asked people that I know who live in Akala or have camped and hiked in the Akala National Forest, and they'd never heard of this story. I really didn't know if this person who told me this story knew if it was true or not. Sounds like it might be true and strange, and weird things have happened in state and national parks. But I do know that over the years people have gone into the Akala National Forest and never come out. Some of them were harmed or killed by animals. Others had their lives ended abruptly by other humans. And some just vanished without a trace. I've driven through the forest on State Highway 40, and at night, it's creepy, even in the day, at times. Next story by Adam Milanovic. I used to do a lot of exploring in my younger days, mainly when my friends and I would skip school and decide our time was better spent finding new places to explore than actually learning in a structured environment. I'm Australian, and one of our favourite places to explore was a place called White Bay Power Station, which was a coal-powered station that closed its doors on Christmas Day, 1983. We were exploring between 97 and 2000, so the decay had well and truly set in by this time. On a side note, films such as The Matrix Reloaded and Mission Impossible had parts filmed here. Anyway, this place was absolutely huge. It had all of the usual abandoned adornments, such as graffiti and satanic signs and messages scrawled over the walls. There was also a time we went and found a freshly dead pigeon, which had a noose around its neck. It was multi-leveled. The exact number of levels were too hard to determine because it would all depend on which flight of stairs you took, which part of the power station you entered from, and which actual part of the power station you were in. On some flights of stairs, you could be 8 floors up and be able to see through the metal staircase you were standing on due to it decaying from rust. The most dangerous thing about this place was the way some levels would just drop off. There would be a big concrete platform, then nothing, no railing or anything to stop you falling off. There was also a door which we opened that took us to the roof. A roof I nearly fell off of because I got dizzy from the sheer height of it. Though the scariest part of the whole power plant were the big chutes that they used to store the coal in. This is hard to explain, but I'll try my best. Imagine having 2 thin metal catwalks on either side of the huge metallic voids. You couldn't see more than 4 feet in front of you on the catwalks because of the sheer darkness, and on the inside of the voids that the coals were stored in. You couldn't see more than 4 feet in front of you on the catwalks because of the sheer darkness, and the inside of the voids that the coal was stored in were the blackest darkness you can imagine. So basically standing on these catwalks were much like walking the plank, except you can't see anything in front of you, and if the floor below you gave way you were done for. We also used to frequent old train tunnels in Sydney. It was quite startling to be walking through a pitch-black tunnel. Came around the bend to see the light from the other side, with the figure of a person walking towards you. This used to happen often, as the homeless and drug users would take refuge in the tunnels to either get out of the elements or to get high. Funnily enough, some of the best tunnels were put back in use for the 2000 Sydney Olympics, like tram services, and now they're all cleaned up and well lit. Another type of place we used to explore a lot were underground canals and drainage tunnels. We got so good at mapping them out that we knew which tunnels to take to get us as close as possible to the fast food outlets for lunch. We found one weird tunnel one day. We were walking along and noticed an offshoot, which made us drop to our knees and crawl. At the end of this tunnel, there was what I could only describe as a small water reservoir. The water in it was only about an inch lower than the pipe we were in, and had a newish-looking ladder about 5 foot away on the left side of the pipe we were currently crouched in, and in a metal grate above it. We had to maneuver ourselves on an angle right to lip the pipe and jump to grab the ladder and climb out the gate. We found out pretty quickly that the whole thing looked so new because we were now standing in someone's backyard. Last summer, my boyfriend and I were camping somewhat remotely in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, Presidential Range. The sites are well off the beaten path, not a campground, no water or electric, and a tents only. Sites are half a mile to a mile apart, very deeply wooded and isolated. Without a vehicle, you'd have an hour or so to walk to the nearest road. In spite of this, it's still a known area and frequented by campers and hikers, but it's still New Hampshire, so it's already very weird. Over the course of the summer, we made 4 trips to the same area. The last time was the most remote, with no restrooms. We used the woods. While most people take the general trail, as you can tell where others have been, it really ruins my outdoor pooping experience, so I prefer to find my own new path. In doing so, I wandered a fair distance from our tent site through heavy woods, stopping at the edge of a big thicket of skinny pine trees. I could not have felt further away from civilization or people, and crouching down, thought to myself, as much as any of the animals that must be around me, and I couldn't see. It wasn't eerie, but rather hypnotic, just me and nature. I felt anything, or anyone, could be watching me, and I would never know. Right in front of me as I crouched down, I saw something strange. Out of place were 2 pine trees that had been roughly chopped to about stump size. They're skinny young trees, the types that break easily and can be pushed out of the ground in cold or mushy weather. Each stump was wrapped near the top with grey duct tape, and a lot of it. My immediate thought was something was tied up there, and then the trees were chopped rather than unwrapping the tape? But why? And what? What could have been held there? This was not the end of the trail. It was really in the middle of nowhere. Someone else would have found it the same way I had. There would not be room for a vehicle, or an ORV, or dirt bike. This was someone in the woods. Mort tied something up to these 2 trees using a lot of tape. Suddenly I felt the density of where I was, and that I was within yelling distance of my boyfriend and our tent site, but wasn't alarmed. I could see it wasn't new, but the tape also wasn't faded or worn. I looked around the ground nearby and didn't see anything else with tape or signs that something had possibly been built there. It simply looked like something was tied between 2 trees with duct tape, and for some reason the trees cut at the top above the wrapping, leaving 2 stumps somewhat resembling torches in the ground. Not burned, but that's the best way to describe the appearance. It's important to note, this would not have been used for hanging food or meat. If a person had been tied there, it would have been in a sitting position, and the tape was low to the ground, not high. I took my boyfriend back there later to show him, and we both agreed we couldn't come up with an explanation, other than someone tied up something between those trees. But what, I wonder? More importantly, why? I used to live on a military base in Hawaii, and there wasn't much to do there. I don't know how old I was at the time, but maybe around kindergarten. Hawaii didn't require kindergarten at the time, so I wasn't in school yet. I know that at least. Outside our house, there was a covered car park that people in the community used because the houses didn't have garages, and there were various storm drains that were around the car park. I would always play there since it was right outside our house. I wasn't the brightest, but kids can be dim, right? So one day I was playing there, and I thought it would be fun to drop a thing down the storm drain to see how far it went. I had dropped a few rocks and some small sticks and eventually ran out of things to throw in. So I started saying hello to hear my echo. I didn't expect to hear anything other than my own voice. I was surprised when I got a response. A little girl called back to me. I wasn't scared, just confused. I asked her what she was doing down there, and she said that her and her family lived there. I remembered that I kept trying to look closer, but it was so dark you couldn't see the bottom at all. We sat for a while and spoke. I don't remember the whole conversation, but it went on for a while. I vividly remember the last part of it though, because I felt so guilty and hurt. Years later, I still do, even though I'm not entirely sure it happened. She wanted to play with me, and I said I could invite her in for dinner, and she got really excited by that idea. So I ran inside and asked my mum if my friend could come over for dinner. She said no, and she wouldn't let me go back out to tell her. The next day I went out to explain to my friend what had happened, but she wasn't there. I never heard from the little girl in the drain again. I remember crying that day. I blamed my mum for me losing the only friend I had made there. My mum still remembers this thing happening, and just how upset I was because of it. My dad grew up on a forestry in Queensland, Australia, as the son of a forest ranger. My whole life we've spent a lot of time out in that forest, camping and driving through parts of the forestry that only rangers would travel on occasionally. One place that my dad loved to take us was a little farm in the middle of the forest that was impossible to find unless you knew where it was. Locals knew the place as Spike's Hut. Spike was a local farmer who had lived there for decades until the 90s, and had a reputation for being abrasive, violent, bigoted, and not concerned with the laws of men. He had a habit of approaching guys in the bar who were wearing earrings and tearing them straight out, and there were a few stories about people who displeased him disappearing. Basically, Spike was not a nice guy, and his farm hut reflected that pretty well. Dad would take us out there every time we visited the forest, and the hut would be more and more dilapidated, but the vibe was always the same. That straight-up feeling of being watched, even though Spike was long gone. As I got older, I became more aware of the signs of life in the place when we went to visit. There would be 44-gallon drums full of smashed beer bottles, fire pits with reasonably fresh coals. Someone was definitely out there. God knows why, since the place was literally a snake pit at that point, but that didn't seem too concerned. One trip when I was a teenager, things got strange real quick. My friends and I were piled into my dad's 4x4 and were driving through the bushes to Spike's, so Dad could tell his scary Spike stories and freak us out. We drove onto the property and something immediately caught my eye. Up on the hill opposite Spike's hut, there were what appeared to be a cowboy slumped against a log, hat over his face, taking a nap. Something about his body position looked unnatural and uncomfortable. It wasn't the way you'd sit if you were taking a casual nap in the middle of work, and even if it was, there was no reason for anyone to be out there. The farm was long defunct, and there was no forest business to be taken care of by the property. I pointed it out to my dad, and instead of letting us get out the car at Spike's, as he usually did, he said he wanted to keep driving through the farm to show us something. He maintained that it was nothing, but that if the figure was still there when we came back, he'd stop and check it out. Of course, whatever he wanted to show us seemed totally made up as he drove us through the forest a bit. And when we came back, I spotted the slumped over cowboy again, not having moved an inch, still in the same unnatural position. I yelled out to Dad to stop, reminding him of the promise, but instead he acted like he couldn't hear me, locked the truck doors and drove off the farm faster than he'd ever driven on those dirt tracks before. My friends and I all looked at each other in confusion, but we all knew that when it came to this area, questioning my dad was futile and at best dangerous. My dad denied any of the events that day ever happening after that, but my friends and I were still curious about what was going on out there. So a few months later, we went camping on our own to see if we could find Spike's hut. It took hours of driving through the forest to find the gate to Spike's property, but eventually we found it without Dad's help. Something was just off once we got there, more so than usual for that day. My mates jumped out the car, but were suddenly frozen, not wanting to walk any closer to the hut for no visible reason. The vibe was just wrong that day, and it felt like we had walked into something that didn't belong to us. The tug in my gut to get out was strong, but I'd spent 2 hours finding the place and I was gonna explore it. One of my friends acted brave and walked from the car to the hut with me, quietly acknowledging more and more signs of inhabitants, with nods between us. We said nothing to the others, but were on high alert. It felt like someone could be back any minute, or that they'd never left and were watching us as we poked around the debris. We walked up to the side of the hut to find a kind of small shed with 3 walls, and I heard my friend's voice go squeaky as he called me over to look inside. On the ground was a huge pile of ash from what looked like a cooking fire, and confirming this was the presence of a giant makeshift grill made from cross-hatched wire sitting over the fire, hinged on the shed wall. As I'm looking at this setup, I fear that whoever has been here has been hunting and cooking large chunks of their kill over the fire. Pretty clever, actually. But then my stomach dropped. As my eyes traveled down from the grill to the ground, I saw a baby sock. Tiny, pink, and terribly out of place. Then another. Then a shirt, a ribbon from a child's hair, all sitting right beside the ashes on the ground, next to a woman's weekly Christmas cookbook. That's when the alarm bells in my head went off, and I rounded up my mates to get out. Some ranger or crazy old bushy hanging out at that trashed hut was one thing, but there was absolutely no reason for a baby to be out there. There's no way anything good could have come from having a child's clothes right under a huge fire and grill. When we got back to the campground, we couldn't shake the rotten feeling of being watched, and all of us were so unsettled that we packed up our stuff and decided not to stay the night. When I got home, I told my dad about it, and he just shook it off, saying weird stuff happens out there. Being young and dumb, I never thought to look up missing persons in the area in an attempt to explain either the cowboy or the kid's clothes. But I can tell you, I will never make the mistake of going out to Spike's without my father again. One of my favorite hobbies used to be exploring old and abandoned mines, mostly for the hell of it, but occasionally you would find some sort of mineral debris that you could bring back home as a trophy. I went with friends, and I went alone. It was an obsession for a long time. That is until the following event. I always used to dedicate my Saturday afternoons to exploring abandoned mines, once I knew where they were. There used to be a website that I was fairly active in, where people would share where they had found abandoned mines and potential routes for trying to explore them. I always had a lot of fun and rarely ever bumped into anyone doing the same thing I was when I was doing it. We'd built up quite a little fun online community, and one day I'm challenged by someone I knew online to check out this particular cave. It was a cave/abandoned mine. It seemed to be quite old, dating back to the mid-1800s. They were of course searching for some mineral, and I don't know whether they found it or not. Point being that it was apparently scary, but structurally rather safe. So, after doing a little bit more research, I waited for the opportune moment, i.e. a Saturday afternoon, and went on my merry way. When I reached the structure itself, which was very remote and took over a 2-hour drive to arrive to, I was pleasantly surprised. It was indeed very well preserved, and I could park my vehicle there with ease, which is something that you'll find is often more challenging than you may expect. I donned my usual gear and stepped inside. With my flashlight on, I started looking around, taking in the scene, the sight, the smells, and having my camera at the ready. I made sure, from my own point of view, that it was structurally safe, and started making my way in. This was always the best part, leaving the light behind and entering a world of darkness. It was like being swallowed whole. After a few footsteps, it became eerily dark, and the smell of damp permeated my nostrils. I loved exploring. Clearly I wasn't the first person to be here. Countless graffitis and carve masters had been here and etched their names and logos onto every corner of the wall. This is common while exploring. You'll find this early on, but when you get to the true darkness, is when people tend to shy away. The further in you go, the less artwork you see. I carried on going in, taking in all of my surroundings. I reached a part that my friend had told me about. It was a very narrow tunnel. It was almost like one of those moving walls you see in Lara Croft, or perhaps a better way to describe it, trying to move through 2 slices of almost touching bread. I don't know why they designed the tunnel this way. Surely they had a good reason. Perhaps there were some objects that they simply couldn't pass. So I shimmied my way across, flashlight at the ready, and carried on into the darkness. There were many twists and turns, and all of it fun. I also need to point out that I use a red chalk in order to mark my way. This way I never forget where I've been and can always make my way back by following the red chalk. It also helps that I draw arrows along with my lines. As I'm going along, I hear something in the distance. What sounds like water, which isn't an uncommon thing, but the sound of water is something else, as it means there's a drip, which can mean structural instability in some places. Curiosity got the better of me though. This was certainly an interesting cave. Lots of debris and lots of interesting stuff being left behind. I'd found an old mining helmet, funnily enough. I didn't dare take it though. I like to leave history where it remains, but carried on my exploration. By this point I was fairly certain that I was one of the few people who'd ever ventured this far in quite a long time. Just as I was walking though, do I hear something behind me? What sounds like footsteps. I stop in my tracks and turn around. There's no one. I'm starting to feel quite hot. The room is getting significantly smaller, and I know from my friend's description that this means I'm going to be entering a much larger cavern very soon. Excitement is building, and just as I get towards the end, it narrows even further. There's a brief slit in the rock, just enough for a man to pass, that clearly has been worked on by many men as a hole to climb through. So I look out. Looking down, I see that there's a drop, a significant one, and realize this is where I'll need my rope. Fortunately for me, I think I can make the jump, and with the rope secured, make my way down. This place was volatile as hell. There were a few holes in the middle. I think maybe that the ground gave way there, and that's when I realized it probably wasn't the best idea to be in this place. But my friend assured me that around the edges I'd be fine. I only wanted to take a few pictures and make the most of my time here before I went back. Just as a, see, I managed to do it kind of thing. That's when I heard it. The voice of my grandfather speaking. Only 2 words. Get out. They echoed through the cave, and I turned around to where the sound had originated from, to illuminate nothing and no one. The thing is, my grandfather has been dead for 20 years. This severely creeped me out. I decided to put 1 foot back on the rock and make my way with the rope back up to the small passage. I looked out again after I'd got my picture and wondered what that was all about, and told myself that it had all been in my head. I started to make my way out, thoroughly spooked, when I heard it. A loud bang and a sharp grinding sound. It was unmistakable. The hole that I had seen previously had gotten bigger and consumed some of the land from the top. Is it possible that the voice of my dead grandfather saved me? Had he kept me from falling and perishing in the abyss? Because it was my intention to stay there a while longer. If I had done so, could it have been the end of me? That seriously changed my outlook on what I was doing, and started choosing my caves more carefully the next time, and after a few more attempts I stopped going altogether. I realized just how dangerous it was, and elected to do something a little less life-threatening. Grandpa, if you're out there, thank you. I was 16 at the time, and at a small hunting camp near the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. The camp has a fairly large pond when you drive in. The camp itself is in one large circle with a couple of branching roads. When you come in, you can go straight and sit up by some old growth pine with nothing growing at the bottom, and nestled in is a little shack. To the left will take you by the pond, and you can continue onto the road and circle up to the mountain where it links with the other road. I have a place on this side about 2.5 miles from the pond. At about 10 p.m. one night, I decided I wanted to go camp fishing, so I loaded up my 4-wheeler with tackle, a road mining hat with a light, and a hatchet for any snakes, and drove down to the pond on the rocky dirt road. I get down there about 10:30, and my first line is out. When I'm at the wooded area to my right, that's as thick as blackberry bushes with a path cut through to another fishing spot, the road to my left and back down is a little dip. I fished for about an hour and a half, only catching one small fish when I felt eyes on me and heard a branch snap. Now I've been in the woods my whole life at this point, so I grabbed my hatchet and set it in my lap and keep an eye in the woods, what little bit I could, with how thick it was, thinking it was at worst a coyote or black bear. About 30 uneasy minutes pass, never really feeling the eyes leave me. Then suddenly the air was thinned and everything felt normal. About 10 more minutes pass, and I hear a loud skittering and then a thud coming from the direction of the old pine grove. Thinking one of the drunks out there had gotten out and fell, I got up and make my way over to the bank, past the little shed into the old grove, scanning back and forth with my light mounted to the hard hat when it happened. In the very edge of the light was a pale humanoid figure on all fours. Its eyes darted to mine. We locked eyes, it being in the edge of the light. I didn't get a good look, but I froze in complete terror, knowing that if I turned my back to it and run, it might react like a cougar and pounce. I readied the hatchet to defend myself and took a step back. It took one equal in distance to mine towards me. This continued down the bank, it stopping at the top to gaze down at me. Without taking my eyes off it, or turning my back to it, I turned on the four-wheeler, angled the lights to it, and after I do that, I packed my stuff, not turning my back, and hopped on. I floored the four-wheeler at it, making it back up, and tore down the road to the left, hitting 30 to 40 down the road I normally take at 15. I look over my shoulder and see this thing running on all fours beside me. This went on for about half a mile until it stopped, crawled into the middle of the road and watched me drive off. I get to camp as fast as I possibly can, load up my weapon in the corner of my room, and don't dare sleep that night. The moral of the story, don't turn your back and run from the unknown, unless they come at you first, and never go catfishing alone. I was born and raised in Charlotte, and still live on the east side. There is a local public park near my parents' house called McAlpine Creek, which is mainly a large cross-country trail stretching miles across East Charlotte. The park is enveloped by hundreds of acres of dense forest and underdeveloped land that is discreetly amidst busy streets and highways. You almost don't realize how big the forest stretches because of the infrastructure around it. There is a myth, folklore tales about a devil church or Satan church deep within the park. There are a few videos on YouTube and other forum posts around the web of local attempts to approach it. A simple Google search, and you'll surely find it. In my senior year of high school, scourging the internet about the supposed church, I had somehow found a somewhat vague description of the location from someone who had attempted to go down the roads deep within the park to find it. My girlfriend at the time and I, one Friday night, decided to try and find the road that leads to the church. We drove down the winding roads behind a Carmax that borders the dense woods of the park, where there is a small neighborhood of sorts. Cautiously driving down these quiet and dark roads, we had found a seemingly abandoned dirt track offshooting from the paved road. Keep in mind there are almost no streetlights anywhere. While driving for about 2 to 3 minutes, there had been a pickup truck in front of us, maybe 50 feet or so away. Upon seeing the dirt track, our interests peaked. We stopped the car to discuss what we wanted to do. We began to slowly pull onto the dirt track. Simultaneously, the pickup truck ahead of us abruptly stopped and sat in place. We noticed this, having fully pulled into the dirt road at this point, and immediately stopped and stood still, frozen in panic. The driver of the truck quickly put his or her car in reverse, and we could see the rear reverse lights on, and began to immediately back up towards us. I threw my car in reverse in panic, and attempted to turn back the way we had come. I was able to get turned around and back into the driveway fairly quickly. In reverse, the driver of the truck was accelerating very fast towards us, and I floored the gas of my Nissan Altima, and the truck driver followed us for a few seconds and then stopped. We never looked back. We never found the supposed church, but this happening scared the hell out of us, and I've never considered attempting to return. few years ago, my boyfriend worked in a warehouse that was out in the middle of nowhere, in between railroad tracks and the river. On one side of the warehouse, there was dense forest. He had gotten done at work around 8 p.m., right as the sun was setting. He was sitting outside waiting for his ride and talking to me on the phone. The conversation was normal until I heard his tone change. My boyfriend doesn't want to show much emotion at all, but I could instantly tell something was wrong. I asked what was going on, and he explained that he thought he heard a baby crying from inside the woods. Now, I probably would have second-guessed and thought he was joking around because that's his personality. But the way he was talking, I could tell he was serious. The cries went on for a while, and he said that they eventually turned into wails, and it didn't sound like it was too far. He disconnected our call much to my dismay and sent me an audio recording of what he was hearing. Sure as hell it was the sound of a baby. He told me he was tempted to go into the woods and try to find the source of the sound, and I begged him not to. Something didn't feel right. Thankfully, his ride came to get him before he could step into the forest. I've heard these kind of stories before, and many say that it's something or someone in the forest trying to lure people with the sounds of a baby crying. But I can't wrap my head around it. It honestly gives me chills when I think about it to this day. Even my boyfriend doesn't talk about it much because it genuinely freaked him out. I guess I'm just curious to see what you will make of it. One of the strangest things that ever happened to me was one time when I was first married, around 1987. I took my wife's brother and 3 nephews camping in a cave. It was located on Highway 17 near Waynesville, Missouri, near the Gasconade River that's not too far from Fort Leonard Wood. This is a huge cave and can be seen from the highway. Directly on the other side of the highway was the Ruby-Doo River. It ran along the highway and dumps right there into the Gasconade River. The cave has 2 large openings. The bigger one has a stream running out. The smaller one to the left has a high dry level place where we can all set up camp, big enough for all 5 of us. I can't remember if it was like the first or second night, but it was around 11 o'clock, and we heard what sounded like a semi-truck crossing the Gasconade River Bridge. Then all of a sudden we heard a horrendous crash, like metal bending and trees crashing, and it all grew silent, and we could hear what sounded like pieces of metal still sliding and clinging down the road, and then silence. We all jumped up and ran down there, and we found absolutely nothing. No wreckage, no broken trees, nothing. That was one of the most baffling things I've ever witnessed. I don't remember seeing any lights, but there were quite a few green trees between us and the highway. I tried to do a search on the net to see if any wreck matched what all 5 of us had heard, but I didn't have a clue how to go about it. It must have been some kind of phantom wreck. I have to preface this story by saying that yes, I was young and dumb and made some major mistakes here. I don't need any judgments, trust me, I know how stupid I was. But on to the story. I was 18 years old and had just joined the army. I was doing my basic training in Georgia in the middle of summer. I was struggling with some mental issues at the time, and to make a long story short, I was in the process of getting chaptered out of the army, aka quitting. My squad mates and even drill instructors had all told me it was going to take months for me to get out, and I'd still be stuck there past Christmas. Mind you, this was June. I was very distraught about the thought of being stuck there, forced to do meaningless chores till January, while my mental state deteriorated. But then a drill sergeant decided it would be fun to deceive me, and convinced me that if I went AWOL, ran away, and made it home, they would simply send me my discharge papers and I would be free. Looking back now, that was clearly a trick, but at the time I was desperate and bought into what he said. I hatched a plan to sneak out at night with a buddy from another unit. We were going to walk on the train tracks in the nearest town and catch a bus home. Easy enough, right? The night finally came for our escape. I snuck out of my barracks and headed to the meeting point. Upon arrival, I noticed my buddy wasn't there, and after waiting 30 minutes I realized he wasn't coming. It was too late for me to try and sneak back in, so I was on my own. I headed to the tracks, made it right onto them, and headed into what I thought was the direction of town. Boy, was I wrong. Walking on the tracks in the middle of the night, surrounded by woods, was a bit creepy, but I figured it wouldn't be long, and that I'd get to where I needed to be. After walking for over an hour, it hit me. Maybe these tracks weren't going to take me where I needed to go. And when I found a dirt path, I made the stupid decision to leave the tracks and follow that instead. The path led me past some fake houses set up for training and continued into the woods. This whole time, mind you, it's dark, and I have nothing but the moonlight to see with. I kept hearing noises in the woods and seeing shapes in the trees and bushes lining my path. Eventually on this path, I spotted some kind of wild dog wolf sitting just off the left side. By the time I had noticed it, it was too late to go back. My only option was forward. I faced the animal and backed up against the right side of the path as much as possible and slowly kept moving down it, never taking my eyes off the canine. Oddly, he never moved or showed aggression, just watched me as I inched by him. Possibly because he was full, or maybe he just wasn't interested in me. I honestly had no idea. After passing him, I continued until my path died and ended in a 50-foot drop. At this point, it had been hours. It was hot. I was alone, scared and thirsty. I had no idea where I was or what my next move should be. So I glanced around my surroundings, and the only thing I could see besides the wood was a radio tower off in the distance to my right. Here is where I made my big mistake. I decided the radio tower couldn't be that far away, and someone had to be there to help me, right? So I left my path, headed into the woods straight towards the radio tower. As you can imagine, it didn't take me long to realize once I headed into the woods that now not only was I lost, but I was lost in the almost pitch black woods, with no way to find my way out. I continued to march in the direction I thought the tower might be in, slowly losing hope of ever seeing anyone again. Now tired and bleeding from my legs thanks to thorn bushes and my dumb idea of wearing shorts, I was on the brink of giving up, where I came across a dry creek bed with a log in the middle, and out of frustration and hopelessness I climbed onto the log and screamed as loud as I could for someone to help me, which of course got no response. After several more screams, I heard a rustling in the bushes on the creek bank behind me, and I turned around just in time to see 3 wild dogs jump out of the bush and glare at me like I was dinner time. I absolutely lost it here. I ran in the opposite direction of them as I heard them taking off after me. I was terrified, running through the darkness with them chasing me, screaming at the top of my lungs and thinking that this was going to be how I'd die, painfully torn apart by wild dogs in the woods and then eaten. I don't know how far or for how long I ran, but eventually I came to a downed tree that was leaning on another, and I scurried up, praying they wouldn't climb it. I finally looked behind me and they were gone, nowhere to be seen. I wasn't sure if they had stopped chasing me, but I was relieved that I hadn't become their dinner. The rest of the night is mostly a blur of walking through dark woods and hearing other animals. At one point I couldn't do it anymore and was just gonna lay down and give up. As I sat down facing my own mortality, the thought hit me that they probably wouldn't even think to search the woods for me, and that my family, friends and girlfriend would never have any idea of what truly became of me. That thought is what kept me going, and made me continue to try and find my way out. Eventually the sun came up, and I had survived the night. The lights brought with it some comfort since I could now see everything. After a few more hours, I stumbled upon a ribbon tied to a tree, which out here could only mean one thing: a land navigation marker for training. I knew that if I kept following the ribbons, they would eventually lead me out. And eventually, they did. I made it back to the path and ran into a sergeant who was heading out in his truck to go fishing. He returned me to my unit, and I paid for my actions and was eventually discharged. I learned a lot from this experience and have a wonderful life now, and I'm thankful for every day that I'm alive, and will never go into the woods again without a flashlight. While this experience was terrifying and life-changing, I am glad I went the wrong way on that track and didn't make it AWOL, or I would have gone to jail and not been where I am today. Around 8 years ago, me and some friends used to spend our weekends spelunking and exploring abandoned places at night. We didn't vandalize or anything, we would just go to take cool pictures and spook each other around. There is an old abandoned rock quarry in our county that loads of teenagers go to throw parties and get drunk. I hadn't ever been down there before, but my friends had been there, and they were a few years older than me and had partied down there before. There's a huge hill that you have to park your vehicle at the top of, and cross a gate and walk down the hill to reach the quarry. There's a huge pile of rocks in the middle of the land outside of the actual quarry caves. Lots of old equipment and broken down bulldozers. We ventured into the quarry cave, probably 200 feet in, took some pictures and went back outside. There was standing water inside, and we wanted to be as safe as possible. Not knowing how sturdy the ceiling was or how deep the water was. Coming outside, we kept hearing some really strange animal noises. We live in rural Kentucky, so we see bobcats, mountain lions and bears a lot, but usually deep in the woods, which we weren't in at the time. We usually always carried a machete for tearing weeds down and just general safety. We're standing outside of the quarry cave and we're hearing this weird growling, not like a bear or a dog, not like anything we had ever heard before. We had flashlights and we shined them around, looking on the hill surrounding us, and found these huge greenish reddish eyes staring at us. We all looked at each other like, what the hell is that? Whatever it was standing at least 9 feet tall, but it was standing like a human, not like a bear would. It was massive. We could see fur and its head was massive. Its eyes were a good foot or two apart, and we kept standing there looking at it, honestly in shock. We started walking fast up the hill, and it was following us along the hill line. We finally made it to the gate, and when we turned around, it was standing around 30 feet away from us. What we saw wasn't a bear. I've seen black bears around my house plenty of times. We still talk about it to this day. I still believe it was a Bigfoot. My friends think it was too. I've looked up information about the descriptions of other people's sightings, and ours sounds very similar to others, especially the eyes. I'm a 25-year-old, and even though these events happened 11 years ago, I still remember them very clearly. This is by far the creepiest thing I've ever experienced. When I was 14, my family and I moved out of town into a small house situated right in the middle of a cane field. There was a dirt road that led from the main road to the front of our house, and the sides and back were surrounded by cane. I was what my parents called a fitness freak, because exercise was my thing. So I took my dog, Jet, and went jogging early mornings and late afternoons every single day. Because we had just moved to this house, and it being surrounded by cane and all, I had to find a new track to continue my routine. Our house was 2 stories high and my bedroom window faced the front of our house so I could see the main road. After finally moving in my stuff and setting up my bedroom at the new house, I noticed from my window that there was a little dirt road on the side of the main road. Perfect, I thought. It was about 5:30 in the afternoon, the usual time I would go for my job, so I would go and check it out. The road was long and narrow, fitting no more than 1 car, as there were rows of cane on either sides that stood tall and well above my head. I had been jogging for about 15 minutes, and looking back, I could no longer see the main road as this track was straight, but then slightly curved, leading me up towards another house. I could only see the roof of this house in the distance, as the cane was still very high. As I got closer, I noticed a little boy in a red shirt sitting on the top of a roof. He looked about 5 or 6. That's weird, I thought. I remember thinking, how on earth did he climb up there? And if his parents knew he was there, because not only is the roof visible over the cane, as it was obviously a 2-story home. So I stopped jogging and called my dog back, who was running a few meters ahead of me, and turned around to go back. I wasn't interested in going all the way up to the house, just in case I'd be trespassing on private property, or if they had dogs, as mine didn't get on with other pets very well. When I got home, my dad was sitting on the couch watching TV. I asked him if he knew the family who lived up on the opposite dirt road. Nah, no one lives up there, he told me. Well, there must be someone who lives there, I say. I just saw a little boy sitting on the roof. My dad looked at me and lowered his eyebrows as if he didn't believe me. No, Tori, no one lives there. It used to be an old workhouse that farmers used to store their tractors and working equipment in. I was so confused, questioning whether I had just imagined a little boy sitting up there. My 12-year-old sister then walked out the bathroom drying her hair with her towel. Gemma, come jogging with me in the morning? Why? Because I need to see if I'm just imagining something. Okay. First thing in the morning, I dragged Gemma to come along. We left the dog at home just in case there really were people living there. So, what were you imagining? Yesterday, I went jogging on this road, and down the end was a house with a little boy sitting on the roof. So, Dad is saying that no one lives there, and it's bothering me. We get close enough to where the roof was finally visible, and there was no little boy in sight. Let's go all the way in then, Gemma said, and I hesitantly followed. When we got there, it became pretty clear that there couldn't possibly be anyone living there. To try and describe it as best I can, it was a large 2-story house covered in black streaks, as if it had been burnt down once before, and had 3 large square gaps on the front that clearly used to be windows. The stairs to get inside were at the back of the house, and behind that was a small murky-coloured lake. It seemed definitely abandoned, and like it hadn't been used in many years. My dad was right about it being once used as a storage place for farmers. Around the yard were old tires, tractors and cars. In all honesty, the whole place was straight up creepy. This is gonna sound weird, but do you have a bad feeling? Gemma looked at me for a moment before agreeing. Tori? Is that the little boy? She said, her voice shaking. Before I got a chance to answer where, Gemma was pointing towards a small room downstairs with a smashed hole in the window. Through the window, there was a little boy sitting there. We both stared in shock for at least another second, before bolting back down the road. We got home, bursted through the door, telling Mum and Dad what we'd seen. Dad laughed. I told you girls no one lives there. I was getting frustrated. Dad, seriously, Gemma saw him too. They both brushed it off and didn't think much of it. Being dumb teenagers and all. Gemma and I decided to go back in the afternoon to the house with the dog. When we got back there, we checked where we had seen the boy in the morning, but he was gone. Jet was going crazy. We unclipped his leash from his collar and he took off running behind the house and the upstairs. We called out to him, but he wasn't coming back. Great. Now we have to go get him. We walked around the back and started slowly walking upstairs. They were old, rickety, and creaking with every step. Gemma got up the stairs before me, because admittedly I was scared, and I was only halfway up before Gemma called out, "Oh my god, Tori, you have to see this." I walked straight in as the front door was missing and I had chills. On the dusty old floorboards was kids' crayon scribbles and a small blue shoe. If only Dad could see this. I immediately wanted to leave, but Gemma was still calling out to Jet and he hadn't returned. We walked through the kitchen and into an open room of the house and found Jet sitting there staring at a large cardboard box that was at least a meter tall. We looked inside, and it was full to the brim of blank videotapes. Every part of me was screaming to get out. Gemma looked at me and slowly reached in to grab a tape when we heard quick and heavy footsteps coming from the front of the house, exactly as if someone was running towards us. We both panicked and got the hell out of there. It was late in the afternoon and it was starting to get dark. It started pouring with rain as we were running away, and as we got further down the road we looked back, seeing a few shapes of large men standing in the gaps of the windows watching us. When we got home we were sweaty and so far out of breath trying to explain to Mum and Dad what we had seen. "Videotapes? That's weird," Dad said. Mum wasn't so interested, so she chose not to believe us. We explained that when Gemma tried to pick up a tape, we heard what sounded like someone coming towards us, even though it was now dark outside. My dad suggested he would go for a drive to the house and have a look. For some reason, even though Gemma and I were absolutely scared out of our minds, we decided to go with him. We drove up slowly through the dirt road as it was dark and eerie, and all we could see was the gravel of the road directly in front of the car where the headlights shone. We pulled up at the house, thinking it was scary enough during the day, but it was like going to a horror movie during the night. We sat in the car with the headlights shining directly onto the old, creepy house, and darkness surrounding elsewhere. My dad, Gemma and I almost jumped out of our skin, and I swear for a second that my heart stopped beating. It was the sound of a gunshot. It sounded like it was shot no more than a few meters from our car. At that moment, Dad immediately put the car into reverse and spun it around, about to drive off when he just stopped still. My heart was about to beat out my chest and I yelled, "Dad, what are you doing?" Gemma was almost crying in the front seat. I looked at both of them, and they were both doing nothing but staring directly in front of the car. So, this thing I noticed on the way there was since it had rained a bit earlier, there were no tracks or anything marked on the road, since they were washing away by the rain. So our tire tracks were the only ones. Then I saw it. Sitting perfectly upright, on top of our tire tracks was a bullet shell. It's safe to say we never came back to that house, as it's quite obvious we were not wanted there. I began jogging on a track from the back of our house, and have had a much better experience. But still to this day, so many questions remain in my head. I wonder what the hell would have been on those tapes, why there was an entire box full of them, who did they belong to, and why were they being so protected? Some friends and I were going to go hiking on the weekend. We'd usually do this and bring some other friends with us, and would try to find new places to go often. Near my town, there's a small inactive volcano which has a cavern system, and for a while now, another friend and I have been trying to map the thing out. While I went up with my mates in September, we got inside the main cave, which is about a mile long, up until a point where you can't go any further without spelunking gear and is God knows how deep. And I was leading the group, as I'd been there the most. Because it was a leisure trip, we were going to have a good time joking, having fun, the usual stuff. In that spirit, I thought it would be funny to put some ambient to the activity, and played some Aghast, an atmospheric black metal band that supposedly used summoning rituals in their recordings. To be honest, I've never believed that to be more than just a gimmick, because 90s black metal. Still taking into consideration everything, it may hold some truth. Everything was normal. The music played out from my Bluetooth speaker, and we did the whole tour. And on the way back, I was leading the group out. And the last bloke in the line asked us to lend him our torches so he could snap a group picture. We just turned 180 and did so, posing and kept hiking. We got out, we got home, and called it a day. And this is where stuff gets interesting. Normally after a long hike I tend to sleep really soundly when I arrive home, but that night I kept feeling uneasy, like something bad was going to happen. I didn't sleep much. The next day one of my mates posted a picture, and we noticed that indeed something was next to me in one of the pictures. So I guessed that was the reason. That when I got home that night, I swear I could see the thing for glimpses, with its pale face and pitch black eyes just staring at me, like it was sizing me up for something. When I went to bed, I wanted to crap myself. I could see it standing by the door, getting closer to me. At some point, I just started cursing at it, telling it that if it wanted to go down in my own home, I would put up a damn fight. And surprisingly, that thing looked puzzled at that. Like an actor that doesn't know how to follow when another actor ad-libs something. I kept at that, and it just left. This thing didn't surrender though, just for a couple of weeks. It started throwing pebbles at my window and making strange noises. But little by little it just stopped, as if it got bored. I went to high school in a small Minnesota town, mostly farmland intersected by wooded areas and of course dozens of small lakes. One side of my neighborhood was bordered by a relatively large marshland that you could access by a slope that wound down to a trail. This trail curved through the marsh into a big patch of woods about 3/4 of a mile away. In the fall/spring after heavy rains, the fog would often settle over the marsh, as it was much lower than the surrounding area, and it truly looked like something out of a Stephen King novel. After one of these rains, my brother and I, he was probably 13 and I 16, decided it would be a great idea to go explore the woods in the fog. Although the sun was setting fast, we knew that we could make it to the woods in about 10 minutes if we left immediately. We grabbed a couple of flashlights, knowing that it would be dark by the time we got home, and headed for the trail. Once we were in the trail and moving, it just hit us how thick this fog was. We only had been walking for about a minute or two, but we had absolutely no visibility left behind us, and 5 to 10 feet max in front of us. We continued walking for a few more minutes, chatting about hearing noises and seeing red eyes in the distance the whole time, until we came to a curve in the trail. This curve signaled that we were only about 100 yards from the entrance to the woods. At this point there is a small lake on the left side of the trail, and miles of marshland on the right. It's important to note that we have moved further and further away from any house. Our house was the closest to the trail, and the trail moved away from our neighborhood rather than bordering any backyards. We began walking past the lake, and then we heard a splash, definitely larger than a fish jumping, but we had no idea what else would have made that noise. We stopped, waited, and upon hearing nothing else, continued on our way. We couldn't have been gone for more than 15 seconds when we heard cracking and shuffling in the brush up ahead of us to our left. We stopped dead in our tracks and waited. At the end of our eyesight, which could have only been about 10 feet, a figure stepped out from the brush bordering the lake. The fog was too thick to make out many details, but it must have been at least 6'4" and very broad-shouldered. As the figure made its way into the middle of the trail, my brother gasped and it stopped. Its head shot over and looked right at us and just stared. It felt like an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. I felt true horror at that moment, and I've never replicated that feeling. I began to take a small step backwards, and suddenly, the figure took off running into the marshland. Again, there were no houses or buildings or anything for miles in the direction that it ran. Suffice to say, my brother and I sprinted back to the house faster than I've ever done before. I still don't know who or what I saw that day. I hope I never do. My two friends and I were hiking in a national park. We decided to hike the trail, which had much less traffic, and arrived early in the morning. My friends and I did smoke a little bit of the green stuff, but we're not high out of our minds. We were talking about peyote and its psychoactive substance, mescaline, when an older man dressed in shorts, hiking boots, a shirt, sun hat, and with a walking stick overheard us talking about this and decided to get up from the rock he was sitting on to join us on the rest of our hike. We arrived at the entrance of the cave. The older man stayed back while my friend and I explored it. It was very narrow, but opened up to somewhat of a belly run. One way in, one way out. We came back, greeted the man, and he told us he wanted to explore it as well. We told him we would wait for him at the entrance. Mind you, this cave wasn't very deep, and we were in there for a total of 5 minutes. After waiting for him for 15 minutes, we decided to go grab him. When we got into the cave, he was gone. The only thing left was his walking stick sitting in the center of the cave. We called his name and even climbed up into a crevice to see if he had somehow gotten stuck. He wasn't there. Creepiest thing I ever experienced. My aunt, my brother, my cousin, and I were visiting our grandparents' house in Washington. They lived in a pretty remote area with only a handful of other houses around, and a good chunk of forest between each of them. Keep in mind, it also is kind of an island, so they don't get many funky creatures there. My aunt and I went out while it was dark outside, just walking the path into the forest and trying to figure out what was making a loud noise. Anywho, we passed a pond area and made our way to a clearing. When we reached said clearing, I started immediately getting a bad feeling. I figure, it's dark and I'm quite scared of the dark and I'm tired, but nothing's really gonna happen. The path was a bit overgrown around there, so we decided to turn around. Right before we did though, I caught a glimpse of what could have been a really big owl up in the trees just staring at us. Now I'm an Arizona girl, so I don't know what creatures are normal in this forest, but this thing just didn't feel right to me. It gave me a weird vibe. But my aunt kept walking, and I caught up. Keep in mind the path was very short. It only takes about 10-ish minutes to get to the clearing and 10 to walk back. But when we approached the house, we heard my grandma yelling for us. We run back, and she is anxious, saying we've been gone for hours. We swear we'd only been there for half an hour at most. And when my brother and cousin come back, they tell us they'd been out looking for us. We check the time. They're right. Another interesting thing that could be connected, a few days before that, we had heard some really funky noises coming from the woods while we were out there making s'mores. Even my grandparents, who had lived there longer than I've been alive, admit that it was unlike anything they'd heard before. It continued getting closer and closer, and stopped any time someone tried to get a video of it. Eventually I had to go inside because it was freaking me out so bad. That loss of time though still gets to me, especially considering that I don't have an explanation. Was it the owl or the woods? I guess I'll never know. This whole thing probably happened around 6 or 7 years ago. I lived in the middle of nowhere in Ohio and had to make my own fun growing up. I was around 16 at the time, and my friends and I decided to start ghost hunting on the weekends. We've experienced small stuff here and there, nothing too insane, until we went to Rogues Hollow. Now, Rogues Hollow was this old mining town where there were fires, diseases, etc., that eventually made the town cease to exist. It's now a national or state park. I'm not sure. One of the two. But, anywho, we decided it's worth exploring. First off, this place is in the middle of absolutely nowhere. I drove a 98 Chrysler Concorde in those days, and when it was an absolute chore getting there. The gang shows up, there's a total of 4 of us, and it's getting pretty late, and we notice the house/lodge where the park ranger stays, so we park a bit off to avoid getting caught. The gang shows up, there's a total of 4 of us, it's getting pretty late, and we notice the house/lodge where the park ranger stays, so we park a bit off to avoid getting caught. Didn't work out too well. 5 minutes later, we're being questioned by an old guy who was the lone park ranger. He ended up being pretty cool and telling us some of his personal experiences. He said we could continue if we promised not to do any witchcraft or satanic rituals. Apparently that was a big problem that he was dealing with. At this point, we ventured back into the woods where the town previously was, and stuff started getting weird. We could hear what sounded like pickaxes, men working, and voices in many different directions. Needless to say, we were getting a bit on edge and decided to start recording our own little EVP device to see if we could find any stuff. We were getting words like fire, death, devil, and collapse. Eventually we stumbled on an old house. It definitely wasn't inhabitable and was about 50% burnt down, while the others stayed back. As we approached the door, we turned back to our friends to give the old wish us luck, and they were sheet white looking at the second-story building. Directly above us, looking out the window down at us, was a man from the shoulders up and slightly transparent. Then he disappeared. Not leaning back into the house, he was simply gone. Usain Bolt would have been proud of my sprint time leaving that place. Fast forward to the next day, and we're deciding to go back and explore in broad daylight. We were walking around in 2 groups, about 10 yards apart from one another. I was in the back too, about 100 yards in from the wood line, and all of a sudden my friend and I both get grabbed on our shoulders simultaneously, hearing a very soft but distinctive "hello." At this time we turned and booked it out of there, and I haven't been back since. My family and I were having a trip out to the countryside when my youngest cousin found a little cave, just big enough for a child to enter. He started joking around with us, saying he was going into the cave even though his mother told him not to. But being a jovial 6-year-old, he went in anyway. And then there was complete silence. Remember, the cave entrance isn't very big. So after my aunt started shouting at him repeatedly to answer and come down and got no response, she began getting worried. She was scared that it was some kind of animal den, and the animal had got him. But being much larger than a 6-year-old, she was in a predicament, as she couldn't make her way down successfully into the tunnel. Then there was me, a skinny 15-year-old kid who was just small enough to fit through, but mature enough to handle a situation. I volunteered myself as tribute and made my way with my mum's phone as a flashlight into this small cave. It was smelly to say the least, and the further I went in, the bigger it got. There, at the back of the cave, was my cousin. He was passed out. I shined the phone flashlight around in all directions and couldn't see anything amiss. So I gave him a gentle kick in the stomach and asked him if he was okay. He didn't respond, so I flipped him round and he was breathing. Had he fallen asleep? I wasn't entirely sure. I grabbed him and started pulling him out. The hardest part was getting him through the main hole, but he started waking up and crawled his way out by himself. His mother was furious, but the creepiest thing was when she asked what made him go in there in the first place. He said, "The little man asked me to come in, Mummy. He said he wanted some friends." "What little man? There was no one in there," I interject. There was the little man. He was about the size of my hand, and by the time I got inside, he told me to go to sleep, and I did. It was some of the creepiest stuff I've ever heard. There was no one else in that small cave, no little man. It makes me wonder what the hell he saw, or if he just imagined it. When I was working as a backpacking guide in western North Carolina, my schedule dictated a full 8-day shift with 6 days off. During those 6 days, myself and other co-workers would play in the woods. In the summer, you couldn't beat a mountain swimming hole. One of my favorites was called Paradise Falls, alternatively named Wolf Creek Falls. This is a cliff jumping spot with a huge swimming area, a tiny slot canyon, and an inner pool. Most will venture to do the small jump into the inner pool. Even though it's the smallest jump, it's arguably the least accessible. Even though the jump is 9 feet at most, you must work through a 10-minute rock scramble to get to the top of it. We were all venturing in, and from inside the tiny canyon you can't see the main pool. Well, we got to the jump and coaxed the first person off, the fellow guide who had never been to the spot before. She jumped successfully and swam out into the main pool and beach area, and then she screamed. Because she was now out of sight, myself and another guy jumped in together and swam the short distance to her with the others in tow. Of course, we figured she was somehow injured. She was treading water and just staring wide-eyed at the riverbank. When I looked to the shore, there stood a man. He was massively large, easily 6'6" with a little change. He wore beat-up overalls and no shirt, and there didn't appear to be a hair on him. Perhaps the most disturbing thing was that he had folds of skin all over his body. Imagine the Michelin Man, but made of flesh. His face, his arms, chest, everything had a uniformed layer of shingled fat rolls, and he was brandishing a firearm. The area around Wolf Creek is just holler after holler, but there are a few residences, and those few have been there for generations, propagated by the same families. These people don't like outsiders, and so they keep relations within the family. I could only surmise that this individual was the product of inbreeding over decades. He just stood there and watched as we scrambled to grab anything important and shoved it in the bag. He just stood there and watched as we hightailed it out of that basin and back towards the parking area. The whole time, he never said a word. Bear in mind, it's public land. This happened to my mum. Back in her youth, she and her sister would go exploring the local fields. There was an old quarry that had long since been abandoned, and it obviously left a huge gap in the ground, where there was also a cave system. Her and her sister were always told never to go into the quarry, and especially to never set foot in the cave. They, of course, being young and silly girls, didn't listen. So my mum and auntie went in there one day with their friends to try and explore and see if they could find anything of interest. The quarry was chalk, I believe, so I'm not really sure what they were going to find. Point being, they went in, 4 of them in total. The youngest of their friends, Alyssa, was talking about how scary it was when she slipped and fell into the dark. There was a loud, resonating splash, and they looked down, and with just enough visible light, saw her gasping for her life. She couldn't swim. She was screaming and flopping around in the water. So my mum, who could swim, whether it was bravery or stupidity, jumped in after her. It was quite the drop, she says. She told me that when she hit the ice-cold water, it felt like her whole body was freezing up and she found it hard to breathe, but the sheer determination to save her friend kept her going. She pulled her to the side where the edge was, and there was just enough room for them to hold on to. They called for help, and my grandfather came out with a rope and a bunch of the other men and managed to get them out. Both of them got hypothermia as that water was truly freezing, but fortunately they both survived. After that, they got the local government to close the entry and put a huge metal seal on it so that no one could enter. Turns out, they weren't the first people to go exploring, and in the past, other kids had gone in and actually passed away, meeting their end in the icy cold abyss, something that my mother's friend very nearly suffered. I was backpacking through Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina with my dog, just the 2 of us, and we were exploring the woods around Little Lost Cove, open orienteering style, so we were not on an established trail. We'd been hiking through the day following a creek, and towards the evening I noticed my dog was acting abnormally. She was very much caught in the scent of something and wouldn't ease up. This continued for about 2 hours before we made camp. That night in camp she remained on edge and stared off into the woodline. I went about camp business as usual. Then at around midnight I got this prick like I was being watched intently. I let the feeling ride for a bit and kept tinkering with the fire. Then I heard the brush rustle. I got up from the fire and shone my flashlight in the hillside. A figure on all 4s just managed to escape the beam, all but the tail. It was a tail I knew that was not supposed to still exist in the southern Appalachians. I cast my light across the hillside and this time caught its eyes. 2 glowing yellow orbs just watching and waiting. At that point I went into a fury, grabbed my tomahawk and charged up the hill after the beast, screaming curses all the while. The watcher ran off, but neither I or the dog slept that night. The following morning we left camp at first light and began hiking up the mountain to the ridgeline which would lead us out. Atop the ridgeline in the fresh mud were a series of tracks left by an animal that officially no longer exists in the eastern US. They were catamount tracks. They commonly go by cougars in the east, but we'd been stalked by mountain lions just the same. Those tracks ran across the ridge, revealing it had been watching us and stalking us throughout the previous day as we hiked through the creek bed below. They weren't bobcat trails, I know that. They were way too big, as were those eyes I saw. I truly believe that if my dog hadn't been there to give me red flags, I would have been mauled that night, and it remains one of my personal scariest experiences ever. A family member of mine got caught in asylum. He fell in, and it was like quicksand and nearly drowned. He was buried up to his neck before it was shut down, and the sinker stopped. Occasionally the grain on the surface of the pile would crust over, because moisture makes grains sticky and form a hard top. This top is generally hard enough to walk on. The nature of the work was that the workers would enter the silo using rods and push the grains down and allow it to fall, stir, mix and sink correctly. Basically, unstick it by pushing it. So that's what my family member was doing when he got stuck. He pushed some down and brought down a larger portion that must have had an air pocket below him, and the area he was standing on fell away. His feet were buried, and to lift them you'd need to overcome the weight of the grain, packing in and filling all available space. Not safe since the workers weren't tied off. Other persons in the silo were distracted working on another spot. Two-way radios don't work inside of them because they're silos, and also while pushing the grain down, the auger is running. Another hazard here is that at the bottom of them, they have augers, which are metal corkscrews that rotate to pull and push the grain, usually on a conveyor belt, to distribute them to the other silos or chutes. My family member said that if he'd have sunk another 2 feet, he'd have lost a foot in the auger, and then more as he sank, and then more again. Resolution is that after sinking up to his waist, he finally got his partner's attention, who ran outside to the control booth to shut off the auger. Then the fire department came and the EMTs. They worked for about 8 hours to unbury him. Directly lifting didn't work as the grains were too tightly packed together. It was a bit like trying to pull you out of concrete. They tried vacuuming the grains out of the way, and more spilled in to replicate what was removed. The only way to evacuate him of the grains was to reactivate the auger, which was a bad idea. They eventually sunk plywood into the grain around my family member, making a makeshift dam walling off the grain. They could then vacuum enough out to continue lifting without the grain replenishing. He spent 4 days in the hospital from mild crushing and pressure-related trauma, but generally did okay. There was also some muscle damage from failed attempts to pull him out, torn tendons and stuff. As you can imagine, that was a nerve-wracking day. This happened a number of years ago. I was working in a rundown factory that had long since been abandoned, but we had been paid to make sure that no trespassers got onto the property. We had to do rounds every once in a while, and I have to admit, I had slacked the last few hours and written everything off as fine. It was a tiresome job. It was starting to get light outside, and I could see streams of sunlight start to make their way up past the horizon. This was always a good sign, as it meant my shift would be over soon. At 7 a.m, sweet freedom awaited me. So I thought in order to just finish off the books, I'd do one final round of the facility. It takes about 15 minutes to go around, which in fairness isn't very much, but it's just a bit of an annoying walk, due to there being debris and things you have to climb over occasionally if you don't take the longer route round. I grab my flashlight and walk out, as it's still quite dark, and do the usual route, looking around. Keep in mind I'd been doing this job for about a year now, and nothing at all remotely creepy had ever happened. About 8 minutes into the walk, roughly halfway, I'm just minding my own business, looking around, when I hear what sounds like footsteps. I instantly shine my flashlight up to the second level of the factory. I can't see anything, but the footsteps are loud, like they're hitting metal. Now, the floor of the factory is definitely not metal, so I found this quite peculiar. I shout out to whoever's there to reveal themselves so they don't face prosecution charges, but I don't hear anyone. I know at this point I'm going to have to go in, so I grab my key and slot it into the nearest door and make my way up. I climb the stairs, which echo loudly with the sound of my feet hitting them. I knew that this would scare whoever was there, as they usually need to run down these stairs to exit, as the other side is quite far away, and depending on what they know about the factory, means that I have the advantage here. I make my way up, trying to corner my prey, listening out to see who's there, and there isn't anyone. No noise can be heard. I do a whole run of the floor, floor above and floor below. No one to be found. It took me about an hour to clear everything. I was quite shocked, but I assumed they had gotten away last minute. Lock the door and write it off as that, and try and find where they could have breached, but couldn't find the location. I make it back and start searching the video security footage to see where they could have come in from. When I get up the second floor, roughly at the time I was there, I scroll through the images, and although I can hear a brief bang, the one that alerted me originally, I still couldn't find the origin of the sound. It left me puzzled, and when my relief came, I tried not to dwell on it and went home. Still, it's one of the weirdest things that happened, and none of my other co-workers have said to experience anything similar before or since. I heard it on the tapes, so I know it's real. I wonder what it could have been. Red River Gorge is a beautiful and huge park filled with wildlife, rock climbing, waterfalls, dense forest, gorges, and beautiful views. This is a place that feels truly isolated, disconnected from the rest of the world. One evening, in the fall, my boyfriend Duncan and I decided to go camping at the gorge. We found a campground that was as backwoods as possible. Sites were spread far from each other, and our site was on the edge of a very steep drop-off. We arrived at sunset and quickly got to setting up camp. By the time we were fully set up, the sun had set, and we began to make a fire. About 20 minutes into relaxing by the fire, we began to hear howling that didn't sound too far away. We were both freaked out by the realization there were wolves nearby, but we tried not to overreact and continued to sit by our fire. 10 minutes later, I started to hear a faint yelling about 15 feet away past the cliff edges. I told Duncan to be quiet and listen, and we both froze out of fear. A woman was screaming now. I couldn't make out any words at that point, but it was a deep, guttural shriek, a noise that I had never heard a person make in real life. Then I heard it. She was screaming, "Someone help me, please, oh my God," and repeating this over and over, howling it at the top of her lungs. I was terrified. She could have been turned around in the dark and fallen off a cliff or attacked by an animal. At this point, we both sprinted to my car, frantically climbed inside and locked the doors. I tried to call for police, but there was no service. I threw the car in reverse and sped down the dirt road to find anyone that could help, and the shrieks continued. I didn't make it far before coming across a group of 3 young men standing on the edge of the forest. I slowed down and cracked my window, still hearing the woman begging for help, and asked if they could hear that. How could they not? I told them I heard a woman crying for help in the forest, and 2 of them went sprinting into the darkness without questioning me any further. The other one just stood by my car, with no idea of what was happening. While the 2 men were somewhere in the forest, I drove further down into the dirt road until I found a spot to turn around. When I came back, the screaming had stopped, and the men were back by the side of the road. I slowed down and asked them where the woman was, and one of the men that had run into the woods answered, "Don't worry, it's funny actually. It was just a little kid at a campsite further down the trail. He was having a nightmare." I just said okay and drove away as quickly as possible. We left the campsite and went straight home. Once out the woods, we called the local police station multiple times with no answer. I know it wasn't a child. I've never heard such a primal, fearful scream in my life. It makes my skin crawl and my heart race just thinking about it. What did those men get away with that night? And what was I a witness to? I searched the local news for weeks, searching for something reporting details on what it could have been, and came across nothing. I also think it's important to note that this happened in early November of last year, after the camping season was mostly over. We saw very few people there during our time. and I think it is assumed by most people that there won't be many people around this time of year. A few years ago, a friend and I went to explore a nearby limestone cave. I had been there before, but never gone very deep. I have read of a waterfall which eventually leads to an expansive area beyond, so we set out to try and find the path. Since we'd never been on this route, we took turns going forward and checking back to avoid passing points of no return, without one of us being above with a rope to toss down. After the familiar route was behind us, we found a tight climb down. The squeeze was like going from the front seat to the back seat in a compact sedan that's vertical. No problem. Next we find a tunnel, wide but short. We took our packs and dragged them behind our feet, while we crawled maybe 15 to 20 meters. It was getting a little claustrophobic, but we knew what we were getting into. We came to a small opening about the size of half a bathroom. This space we could stand in, and so was a bit of a relief. The path forward was a small square tunnel, the same height as the previous route, but maybe 2 meters wide. We jokingly called it the coffin crawl. This route required us to go one behind the other, and led to a 90-degree turn. At the turn I could see this path continued on past the range of my headlamp, but mostly all seemed level and safe. At this point, slowly, it became apparent the path was getting more narrow ever so slightly. If we wanted to turn back, we would have had to have crawled backwards in single file. I could not speculate how far we had crawled, but it seemed like a very long way, until I could make out a small opening ahead, maybe the size of a cramped coat closet, but 2/3 of the height. At this point, that space was looking pretty comfortable, because it would mean we could at least turn around if we decided to return. Right before coming to the closet-sized space was the tightest squeeze I've ever tried in a cave. I had to place one arm ahead and drag one out to get my shoulder to fit diagonally. As my light illuminated the closet space, I could see a single stalagmite in the center and some bats resting on its walls and sloped ceilings. Small, mouse-eared bats were infrequent but not a shocking sight, until our voices disturbed them and they decided to exit, past our prone, one-by-one bodies. Their fluttering should have been non-threatening, but with the inability to get out it became very unsettling. It took a lot of mental control to avoid panicking from the lack of space, apparent lack of air, and astro heebie-jeebies. After the bats had passed and I caught my breath and sanity, we entered the small opening. Upon the single stalagmite was a small note, the torn corner of a piece of notepaper. The note, in blue pen, read, "Nothing here." We had not found the path we sought, and instead found nothing. Some 20-odd years ago, I was reconnecting with a family member. Said family member lived way up in the hills of North Carolina and had given me directions to his house. I was driving my vehicle and my sister was in hers, following behind. We each had CB radios so we could communicate on the way. We're driving, and I took what I thought was the correct road, and the dirt road immediately climbed to a very steep incline. We slowly made our way up and around this road, and it comes out at a dead end. At the end was an old run-down house with a huge front porch. On the porch was a plethora of things such as an old ironing board leaning against a window, crates of soda pop bottles and a few feed bags. An older gentleman was sitting in a rocker and had a long rifle sitting across his lap. To his left was, I assume, his wife, and she had one of those old-timey wash tubs at her feet and was washing clothes. Then there were several barefoot and no-shirt kids running around. They had stopped when we pulled up at the house, and there were of course several hound dogs laying around. Every one of them just stopped and was staring at us. I slowly rolled down my window and said very politely, "Excuse me, sir, I think we took a wrong turn." He slowly was rocking in his chair with both hands on his firearm and just said one word, "Yep." I picked up the CB radio mic, told my sister, back up now, and we backed all the way back down to the highway. One of the most surreal things I've ever experienced. It was almost like we drove back in time or something. Here's one of my stories from when I lived off the grid in the forest of western North Carolina. Some friends and I lived in these small shacks, essentially a shed with a loft, that were very close together. Living in such primal and close conditions breeds a kind of deep, trusting friendship that you can't get from living anywhere else. So naturally, we did almost everything together. By our little semicircle of houses, there was a railroad track that if you followed it south would lead to a waterfall. This waterfall in particular is where everyone would go to get high. It was a normal night, humid, sometime in early July, and a group of about 6 friends and I, Laura, Andy, Nick, and some of Andy's friends that I didn't know that well but recognized, decided to walk out to this waterfall in the dark. I was the only sober one in the group, so I felt a higher sense of responsibility for everyone and was therefore on edge and hyper-aware of our surroundings. Others would walk faster or slower or stop altogether in the group, so it was natural and expected that we wouldn't be able to see everyone at the same time. Andy was in rare form though. When Laura had to stop to pee, he came out of the bushes and scared her, and then ran off ahead behind the rest of the group. This annoyed both me and Laura since it was such a clear invasion of privacy and unnecessarily spooked in the already spooky night. Laura and I eventually got into where we could see Andy again, but he was walking by himself and then slipped back into the bushes without even looking at us. Dismissing him as just being high, we kept moving forwards, still not back with the whole group yet, and we realized that Andy has followed in behind us, just far enough away that we can only see his silhouette. Finally, we catch up with the rest of the group and see that all of us are accounted for, even Andy. We asked him how he got ahead of us and beat us to the group when he had last been seen 15 yards behind us just a minute ago. Everyone was dead silent, and Laura and I realized that whoever scared her when she peed and followed us wasn't Andy or anyone from our group. We never did make it to that waterfall. Where I grew up, there were a few storm drains that all went to the same pond. My friend Amanda and I were messing around in the woods near one of the openings, and we could hear this really sharp echoing cry that made us both nervous. We thought it was the wind at first, and then Amanda threw a rock into the opening, and it stopped for a minute. So at this point we figured it must be something alive. We climbed back out of the woods and went to the next pipe and could hear it there too. Now, I'm scared, and Amanda is trying to prove how she isn't afraid of anything. So we go to the next one. This one is quieter, so we go back in the other direction. Now I'm being a baby because it's raining a little and I'm not supposed to get my clothes wet. I was 9 at the time, so I'm begging Amanda to go home. As she stops to assure me we are safe, we hear this horrible deep wailing noise and start to panic. I can feel my pulse in my neck, and I'm sweating, and Amanda puts her face into the opening of the drain. The noise happens again, and Amanda takes off down the hill and into the pipe opening. I'm now crying because Amanda abandoned me in the rain, and there's a monster in the pipes. Amanda starts yelling my name, and I have to put my face into the opening to hear her. So now I'm really crying, and she tells me to call the fire department. so I run to the nearest neighbor and tell them to. I explain I don't know why we need to call, but Amanda is in the pipe outside their house. They get all snooty, because Amanda is the heaviest kid in the neighborhood, so they assume she got stuck. They call the non-emergency number, and a truck comes to remove the cover. Turns out Amanda recognized the sound of an angry cat and ran into the pipe. It was a mama cat and her kittens were stuck beneath the wire grate inside the drain, so the rain was drowning them and they were crying. Thanks to Amanda, they got all but one kitten out, and the mama cat in time before the rain got worse. She got to keep one of the kittens, and no one believed us, even though we were both there and the fireman. No one believed she could fit into the pipe. In my little town, there's a twice the ice station. Basically, you can fill up water jugs in 5 gallons and get ice bags for cheaper than you can in the grocery store. I went out a few nights ago to get some water, because who wants to be drinking tap water? My husband was home, and because I'm kind of heavily pregnant, he insisted that he go instead. I wish he would have. It was 1 a.m, dark for miles, and in the middle of nowhere. As I exit my vehicle, I open the back seat up, get the gallon jugs and close the door. As soon as I do, a dark blue truck pulls up perpendicular to me, presumably so I couldn't get out if I decided to get back in my car. Alarm bells start going off, and the bells start screaming at me when the slide door opens and 2 quite large men step out. It's about 20-foot distance between them and me, so I do the first thing I think of. I pull out my phone and answer a phone call from my husband, and answered with, "Hey honey, yeah, I'm almost home." As soon as they see me answer, one of the guys says, and they both get back in their car and peel out the lot, tires squealing and all. I throw my unfilled jugs back into my car and lock all the doors 1,000,000 times or more before I broke down to call him for real. I told him to write down the make and model of the car, color, and that we'd go to the police station in the morning. About 2 days later, there was breaking news of a pregnant woman that went missing. She had been taken, as her father had sworn up and down that she wouldn't just leave. I know it was the men in the blue van, and I've told the police all I know. I don't know if they targeted me because I was a woman all alone in the middle of nowhere, but deep down, I think it was because I was pregnant, and I don't want to think about what would have happened to me or my baby.